You don't remember the first time your soul was wounded. No one does, because it happened before memory even began, before words, before conscious thought. Carl Jung spent decades studying a disturbing phenomenon. People who seem fundamentally broken without knowing why, with no obvious trauma to explain it, no dramatic abuse to point to, just a constant, inexplicable feeling of being wrong, of not belonging, of being fundamentally inadequate in their very existence. And Jung discovered something that completely changed our understanding of narcissistic personality formation. The deepest wounds aren't the ones you remember. They're the ones that happened when you were 6 months old, a year old, 2 years old, when your soul was forming and desperately needed connection, presence, mirroring, and didn't receive it. These wounds didn't turn into memories. They turned into you. They became the architecture of your personality, the foundation upon which everything else was built. And here's the terrifying part. You might be living with a primordial soul wound and never even know it exists. Because how can you miss something you never had? How can you grieve for a connection that should have happened before you could even speak? This video is about those earliest wounds. The wounds that create narcissists before they even know who they are. We grow up believing that personality is a product of conscious experiences, that we're shaped by things we remember. Jung proved the opposite. He showed that the first 1,000 days of life, most of which we don't remember, determine more about who we become than anything that happens afterward. Between 0 and 3 years old, something extraordinary is happening in the human psyche. The self, the core of Jungian personality, is trying to form. It's trying to become a coherent unity, an integrated identity. And to do that, the infant self needs something very specific. It needs to be seen, not just looked at, seen. It needs consistent emotional mirroring. It needs someone to reflect back to it that it exists, that it matters, that its presence in the world is welcome. Jung called this soul recognition. And when that recognition doesn't happen, when there's absence in the place of presence, coldness in the place of warmth, emptiness in the place of connection, something terrible occurs. The infant soul fractures, and that fracture becomes the primordial wound upon which all later narcissism will be built. Let me show you exactly how this happens, but I need to warn you, this is going to hit hard, because if you're an adult struggling with inexplicable feelings of inadequacy, of emptiness, of never being enough, you're going to recognize your own origins in these words, and you'll understand for the first time that it's not your fault. You were born needing something, and you didn't receive it. Emily is 3 months old. She's lying in her crib, awake, alert. She's just been fed. She's clean, physically comfortable. But there's something happening in her rudimentary consciousness, a need that transcends the physical. She looks up at the ceiling, processing light, shadow, movement. And then she hears footsteps. Her mother enters the room. And here's the moment that Jung identified as fundamental. Emily looks at her mother. It's not just a physical gaze. It's a reaching of the soul. It's the infant psyche trying to connect, trying to say, I'm here, do you see me? I exist. The mother looks back, but her gaze is empty. She's checking if the baby is alive, if she's safe. It's a look of inspection, not of connection. She adjusts the blanket, checks the temperature of the room, and leaves. And Emily, at 3 months old, has just experienced her first soul wound. She reached out with everything she had and found emptiness. Jung wasn't being dramatic when he said that this moment, repeated hundreds of times in the first months of life, creates permanent psychic wounding. Because for the baby, There's no concept of mom is busy or mom has her own problems. There's only I reached out and wasn't reached back to. I called out and no one answered. And the inevitable conclusion, inscribed on the preverbal psyche, there's something wrong with me. I'm not worthy of being seen. My soul doesn't deserve recognition. This isn't cognitive memory, it's somatic memory, soul memory, engraved in the body, in the neural structure, in the very formation of the self. And it's going to be there for the rest of her life. But the wound doesn't stop at failed mirroring. Jung identified a second primordial wound, even more destructive. The wound of existential loneliness. Emily is now 8 months old. She's developed the ability to feel separation anxiety. She now knows that she and her mother are separate beings, and that's terrifying. It's the moment when a young child discovers the fundamental loneliness of existence. I'm here. Others are there. There's space between us. And that space can become an abyss. It's night. Emily wakes up crying, not from physical pain, but from something deeper, existential panic, the overwhelming feeling of being alone in the universe, of being severed from vital connection. She cries, and the crying is primitive but desperate communication. I'm alone. I need presence. I need to know that I haven't been abandoned in the void. Next door, a child of the same age cries. The mother comes, picks up the baby, holds her with real presence, says in a soft tone, I'm here, you're safe, you're not alone. She stays, allows the baby to feel her presence until the panic passes, until the infant soul relaxes back into a feeling of safety, of not being lost in the abyss. That child is learning something fundamental. Loneliness can be repaired. Connection can be re-established. The abyss can be crossed. But Emily's mother read a book about baby sleep. A book that says to let them cry it out, that says that responding to the crying will create dependence. So she doesn't go. And Emily cries and cries, and eventually, exhausted, stops. But she didn't stop because she calmed down. She stopped because something inside her gave up. Jung had a name for this, primordial despair. It's the moment when the infant soul learns that the abyss of loneliness can't be crossed, that when you're falling into the existential void, no one is going to catch you, and the conclusion is inscribed even more deeply on the psyche. I'm fundamentally alone. Connection isn't reliable. Presence isn't guaranteed. I only have myself. And here, before Emily is even a year old, before she has a single word, the foundation of defensive narcissism is being established, because if you can't rely on external connection, you have to build an internal fortress. If presence isn't reliable, you have to become self-sufficient, and forced self-sufficiency in a child who should be learning interdependence becomes narcissism in adult life. Hold on, because there's more, and it gets worse. Jung identified a third primordial wound that he considered the most destructive of all, the wound of existential shame. Emily is now 18 months old. She's already developing the rudiments of self-awareness. She already knows she's a separate self. And she's beginning to develop what Carl Jung called the nascent self, the dawning sense of who she is. And this nascent self desperately needs to be celebrated. It needs its very existence to be greeted with joy, with delight. It needs to know that being alive, being who she is a cause for happiness in the people around her. Chloe is playing on the floor. She's discovered something fascinating. If she hits her hand on the floor, it makes a noise. She does it again. And again, and then looks up at her mum with that look that all little children have. That look that says, "Look what I discovered. You see, you celebrate with me." This is a sacred moment in the development of the soul. It's a moment when the child offers her nascent self to be witnessed, to be valued, to be celebrated. The mother looks and says with irritation in her voice, "Stop that, it's giving me a headache. Go play quietly." 3 seconds. 3 seconds is all it took, and the message is etched into Chloe's soul. What I am is irritating. My joy is a problem. My existence causes pain to others. Jung called this primordial shame. It's not shame about something you did. It's shame about something you are, and unlike guilt, which can be processed and repaired, existential shame becomes part of the structure of the self. It buries itself so deep that you stop noticing it's even there. You just feel, vaguely but constantly, that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, and this is where narcissism begins to emerge as a defense, because primordial shame is unbearable. It's a pain that the psyche simply can't process. So the psyche does the only thing it can do. It builds a grandiose defense. If I am fundamentally inadequate, I'll create an image of being superior. If my essence is shameful, I'll construct a perfect persona. If who I am is not celebrated, I'll force admiration. And this little child, less than 2 years old, is already laying the first brick of the narcissistic wall that she'll build for the rest of her life. Chloe is now 2.5 years old, and something critical is happening. It's the period that developmental psychology calls the birth of the ego. It's when a child starts to say, "I want, I don't want, I do it myself." It's a moment of natural individuation, of beginning to define the self as separate, and Jung understood that this moment is the ultimate test. Either the family celebrates this birth of the individual self, or it crushes it. And for Chloe, it's going to be crushing. She's learning to dress herself. She chooses an outfit. It doesn't match, red with purple with yellow, but to her, it's the perfect expression of who she is at that moment. She gets dressed, comes to show her mother with radiant pride. "Look, Mom, I did it myself." The mother looks, makes a face of horror. "You are not going out like that. What will people think? You look like a clown. Go change right now." And again, the message is engraved on her soul. "Who I choose to be is unacceptable. My natural expression is shameful. I'm only acceptable when I am what others want me to be." But there's more. Because in these same months, Chloe is experiencing another fundamental thing. She's starting to feel complex emotions, and she needs help regulating them. She's frustrated because a toy isn't working the way she wants it to. She starts to cry, throws the toy. She's starting to feel anger. And anger at 2 years old is an overwhelming emotional tsunami. She needs someone to help her navigate this storm. She needs co-regulation. She needs her mother to say with calm presence, "I know you're frustrated. This is hard. Let's breathe together. You'll be okay." That would be healthy development. The child would learn that intense emotions can be felt and regulated with the help of connection. But Chloe's mother says with a harsh voice, "Stop whining now. You're making a scene over nothing. If you don't stop, I'll give you something to cry about." And here is the wound that will generate the core of adult narcissism. Chloe is learning that true emotions are unacceptable, that vulnerability is punished. That feeling is dangerous. So she begins, at 2 years old, to build what Jung would call a false self. A self that doesn't feel, a self that doesn't need, a self that is perfect, controlled, self-sufficient, a narcissistic self. And here's what makes these primordial wounds so devastating. Jung observed that wounds that happen before language cannot be processed by language. You can't do talk therapy to heal a preverbal wound. You can't talk about something that is inscribed in the neural structure before words even existed. These wounds live in the body, in the nervous system, in somatic memory. Chloe is now 3 years old. She's already showing the first signs of what will become narcissism in adulthood. When another child cries, she doesn't feel empathy. She feels discomfort and moves away, because seeing vulnerability in another person activates her primordial wound. It reminds her of her own vulnerability that was rejected. When she does something and expects praise but doesn't receive it, she doesn't just feel disappointment. She feels unbearable existential shame and immediately compensates with grandiosity. I wasn't really trying anyway. I don't really care. That was easy. When she wants something and doesn't get it, she doesn't learn tolerance for frustration. She learns that not getting what she wants confirms her fundamental inadequacy, so she throws a tantrum, demands, manipulates, anything to avoid feeling that primordial wound of not being enough. Her parents look at these behaviors and say, "She's difficult, she's spoiled, she's dramatic." They don't know, they can't know, that they're seeing a wounded soul trying to survive in the only way it knows how. And now comes the part that no one talks about. The part that other videos about narcissism avoid because it's too uncomfortable. These primordial wounds weren't caused by monsters. Most of the time, they were caused by normal parents. Parents who fed, who clothed, who took them to the doctor, who fulfilled all the physical duties. Chloe's mother isn't an abuser. She never hit her, never screamed horrible things. She was just emotionally absent, just too preoccupied with her own problems. Just followed advice from books about not spoiling babies. Just repeated the pattern that she herself received. And this is what Jung tried to make people understand. The deepest wounds aren't always the most dramatic. They're the absences, the voids, the lacking, the mother who holds the baby but with her mind somewhere else, the father who is physically present but emotionally absent, the family that functions perfectly on the surface but has no soul. And the child who grows up in this environment doesn't have dramatic, traumatic memories to point to, can't say, "My parents did X horrible thing," can only feel vaguely but constantly that something fundamental is missing, that there's a hole in the center of their being, and spends their life trying to fill that hole with achievements, with validation, with control, with forced admiration, with narcissism. Because narcissism isn't about thinking you're better than others. It's about desperately trying to convince yourself that you're not fundamentally inadequate. It's about building an inflated self to compensate for the core wound that tells you you're not enough. Emily is now 7 years old, and the narcissistic structure is solidified. She's the quintessential perfectionist child, gets excellent grades, always impeccably dressed, always well-behaved. Teachers love her. Other parents say, "I wish my daughter were like Emily." And no one sees, no one realizes that behind this facade of perfection, there's a terrified child, because perfection isn't about excellence. It's about survival. It's about avoiding, at all costs, feeling that primordial shame again. And Emily has already learned that failure reactivates the wound, that not being the best confirms her fundamental inadequacy. That showing need, vulnerability, imperfection brings abandonment, so she doesn't show it, ever. She's at school. Another girl, Ashley, falls on the playground and scrapes her knee. She's crying. Emily watches and feels something strange. It's not compassion, it's disdain, it's irritation, because seeing Ashley vulnerable, needing help, crying unashamedly, touches Emily's deepest wound. It reminds Emily of her own vulnerability that was rejected when she was just 8 months old, of her own cries that went unanswered, of her own needs that were ignored. And because Emily can't process that pain, she projects. Ashley is weak. Ashley is being dramatic. Ashley is just putting on a show. Jung would explain it this way: Emily isn't being malicious. She's seeing her shadow in Ashley. She's seeing the rejected part of herself. The child who cried alone in her crib, reflected in another person, and seeing the shadow in another is unbearable, so she judges, criticizes, distances herself. This is the birth of the lack of empathy characteristic of narcissism. It's not that narcissists don't have emotions, it's that the emotions of others activate their core wounds. And core wounds are so painful that the only defense is to dehumanize whoever activates them. But Jung didn't let the story end in despair. He had a profound compassion for the wounded souls, and he dedicated his life to answering one question: can core wounds be healed? If the damage happened before memory, before language, before conscious thought, is there a way back? His answer was cautious, but hopeful. Emily is now 32 years old. Externally, her life seems perfect: successful career, relationships that function on the surface, impeccable image. But internally, there's an emptiness that nothing fills. There's a constant sensation of performing, of feeling that if anyone saw who she really is, they would run away. She's in therapy, not because she wanted to be, but because she had an inexplicable breakdown. She was in an important meeting, presenting a project, and suddenly, out of nowhere, she started to cry. She couldn't stop. She couldn't explain it. She just fell into absolute panic. And her therapist, trained in a Jungian somatic approach, does something that no other therapist has done. He doesn't ask about memories. He doesn't ask her to talk about her childhood. He asks her to simply notice what she's feeling in her body. "Where do you feel the panic?" he asks. Emily closes her eyes and feels in her chest. It's a sensation of falling, of being alone in a void, of reaching out and finding nothing. The therapist recognizes it. He knows. It's somatic memory. It's the core wound emerging. "How old are you now?" he asks gently. Emily opens her eyes, confused. "What?" "When you feel that sensation of falling, of being alone, how old are you?" Emily closes her eyes again and feels, and suddenly knows. "A baby. I'm a baby." And then she cries. But it's not an adult cry. It's a primordial cry. It's the cry of an 8-month-old who was left alone in the abyss. And the therapist doesn't try to stop it. He doesn't try to fix it. He just stays present, and he says the words that Emily needed to hear 3 decades ago. "You are not alone now. I am here. You are safe." And this is the beginning. It's not a quick cure. It's not an instantaneous transformation. Jung was always honest. Core wounds take years to heal, because you can't heal with words what was wounded before words. You have to heal on a somatic level, on the level of bodily experience, on the level of real and present human connection. Emily spends the next few months learning something revolutionary. She's learning, for the first time in her life, to feel sensations without immediately defending herself from them. She's learning that when the primordial shame emerges, she doesn't need to build compensatory grandiosity. She can just feel and survive the feeling. She's learning that when the existential loneliness appears, she doesn't need to isolate herself in narcissistic self-sufficiency. She can reach out and be reached back. She's learning, word by painstaking word, the language of emotions that she never learned as a baby. This is sadness. This is fear. This is anger. This is shame. This is joy. And slowly, very slowly, something extraordinary happens. The core wound doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling her entire life. The false self, the perfect narcissistic persona that she built, begins to crack, and behind the cracks, for the first time since she was a few months old, the true self begins to emerge, scared, vulnerable, imperfect, real. Remember this: the deepest wounds are the ones you don't remember, and you can spend your whole life compensating for a wound that happened when you were 6 months old, building defensive narcissism on top of primordial shame, creating a grandiose self to hide the feeling of being fundamentally inadequate. But core wounds have one characteristic that Jung discovered: they exist on a pre-verbal level, and because of this, they can be accessed through the body, through sensation, through present experience. You don't need to remember the exact moment you were wounded. You need to feel where the wound lives now, in the tightness in your chest, in the sensation of falling, in the inexplicable panic, in the shame that has no reason. And when you feel it, when you finally allow that 8-month-old child inside of you to be seen, held, not left alone, the healing begins. It's not quick, it's not easy, but it's possible. And on the other side of that journey, there's something you've never had but always needed: your true self. Not the performance, not the perfection. You, the soul that was wounded, but that never died. That was always waiting, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be celebrated, waiting to discover that being alive, being exactly who you are, is a reason for joy, not a reason for shame. You've just discovered something that changes everything about narcissism. The most destructive wounds happen before memory begins, before words, when the infant soul is forming and needs connection, presence, recognition, and doesn't receive it. That truth is uncomfortable, because it means that families that seem normal can still create devastating primordial wounds, not necessarily through dramatic abuse, but through absence, through emptiness, through failing to truly see the child's soul. Each video like this requires deep research into Jungian psychology, developmental psychology, and the neuroscience of preverbal childhood trauma. It demands that we look at the wounds that society prefers to ignore. So when you use the super thanks button down below, it's not just financial support, it's you saying that this truth about primordial wounds needs to be known. When you click that golden heart, you help bring light to the wounds that exist in the collective shadow, the wounds that children carry in silence, because they don't even have the words for them. You're not just a spectator, you're a conscious survivor, recognizing the core wound. You're becoming part of the movement that's healing what was wounded before memory even began. But there are 3 key signs that you might be carrying an unhealed primordial wound. First, you feel unexplainable shame, not shame about something you did, but shame about who you are. You wake up with a vague yet constant feeling of being wrong. This is existential shame. It's the wound from when your nascent soul was rejected before you had the words to understand it. Second, you oscillate wildly between grandiosity and complete collapse. One day, you feel superior, special, above others. The next day, you feel completely inadequate, like a fake, an imposter. This oscillation isn't bipolarity. It's defensive narcissism, fighting against the primordial wound. It's an inflated self, trying to compensate for the deep-seated feeling of not being enough. Third, you have inexplicable difficulty with intimacy. You crave connection. But when someone gets too close, you pull away. You yearn to be seen, but you're terrified of being known, because real connection activates the wound from when you reached out with everything you had and found emptiness. And your nervous system remembers, even if you don't. The truth that Carl Jung tried to teach us is this: narcissism doesn't arise from an excess of self-love. It arises from a primordial wound of never having been adequately loved. From having reached out as a baby and not having been reached back to. From having offered your nascent soul and having it been rejected. From having felt existential shame, even before you had words to name it. These wounds happen before memory, but they live in the body, in sensation, in the nervous system, and they can be healed, not with words alone, but with presence, with someone finally staying when you're falling into the abyss, with someone finally seeing your soul when you offer it, with someone finally saying, "You're not alone, you are enough. Being alive is a reason for celebration." That's the promise of Jung. Primordial wounds are deep, but they are not a permanent sentence. There is a path back to the true self. There is the possibility of living, not as a narcissistic persona, performing perfection, but as a real person, wounded, vulnerable, imperfect, but finally whole. Do you remember your first wound? Probably not. Because it happened before memory. Are you in the "I know I have a primordial wound" camp, or the "I don't know if I have one" camp? Comment below. Also, let me know if you feel an unexplainable shame about who you are, not about what you did. Many will recognize it, that existential shame that's been there since forever, that has no logical reason, but that controls everything. I'll respond to everyone, because recognizing the primordial wound is the first step to healing it.